Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily update for the first day of March 2021. Well, many of you are pretty clear on the importance of what I'm about to discuss, but for those who aren't, I'm coming back to this question of why geopolitics and the adherence to geopolitical strategic thinking is the pathway toward war and destruction. We've not escaped this. In fact, the strike on Syria last week by the Biden administration indicates a continuing pattern of U.S. administrations increasing our engagement in useless and futile wars in the Middle East. And I'm going to discuss this from the higher strategic standpoint because we must escape this pathway or we'll eventually end up in a situation where nuclear war with Russia and or China becomes inevitable. Now, there is no more important issue than this, so it has to be taken up. Now, let's just look at the insanity of what happened last week. Allegedly, the action to hit an encampment of an Iranian militia inside Syria near the Iraq border was taken in retaliation for an Iraqi-based, supposedly Iranian group that launched an attack on a U.S. base inside Iraq. First of all, the U.S. is illegally in Iraq. The Iraqis asked us to leave. We are still there on the basis of a 2002 or 2001 authorization to use military force. You're supposed to keep going to the Congress to update this, but the United States never has, so we're there illegally. Secondly, the strike was on an Iranian-backed militia unit in Syria. But what's that Iranian-backed militia unit doing? They're combating the continued presence of ISIS in the region. Supposedly, we're against ISIS, and yet we're attacking people who are fighting ISIS. Now, to make the situation more insane, the ISIS forces in Syria had been backed by the Obama-Biden administration, as proven by releases put out by General Michael Flynn. So what's the point of this attack? Well, according to John Kirby, a spokesman for the Pentagon, it's to de-escalate the overall situation. So you de-escalate by a strike which kills at least 22 people? This makes no sense unless you're captured in the logic of geopolitics and war, the idea that you must maintain a continuing confrontation with forces that you may be backing or that may be engaged in false flag operations to give you an excuse to continue the war. Is this going to be the direction of the Biden administration? Now, before the Trump administration was taken over fully by the war hawks under Pompeo and Esper and others, Donald Trump had been very clear on the situation in the Middle East. No to endless wars and collaboration with Russia and China to put an end to these wars and to collaborate against terrorists. For example, with Russia in Syria and with Russia and China in North Korea. That was a clear policy and one that deserved the support of every American. Now, unfortunately, the policy shifted during 2020, especially with Pompeo doing a world tour to organize military opposition, or I should say military confrontation with Russia and China, with Pompeo traveling around insisting that we needed eastward move of NATO and eastward move of NATO to the South China Sea, to the Indo-Pacific region. And along with that was a policy of sanctions against Russia and China. Now, will Biden return to this policy of endless war or not? There was an excellent presentation given Saturday at a Schiller Institute conference in which I participated, a presentation by Mike Robinson, who's a distinguished investigator and radio talk show host in the United Kingdom, on how the British Empire is engaged in pushing for new geopolitical wars, which completely confirms our analysis. And I'd recommend that people go to the Schiller Institute website and look at Robinson's presentation because it was immaculately detailed presentation showing who is who in the war party in the United Kingdom. And much of what's done in the United Kingdom is then reflected through the intelligence services in the United States, going way back to the post-World War II period, but in the more recent period, the original Iraq War, where Thatcher got George H.W. Bush to invade Iraq on phony pretenses, to the 9/11 attack, which went against Iraq, where Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, but the British convinced George W. Bush that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and so on. Virtually every time there's a U.S. escalation in the region, it's initiated by British lies. Now, what Robinson detailed is how the Integrity Initiative, which is funded by the British Foreign Office and other so-called objective groups like Bellingcat, promote an anti-Russian, anti-China narrative devoid of evidence, just as Russiagate was a completely made-up story. And it's designed to provoke anti-Russia, anti-China actions. Included in this is the Henry Jackson Society, to which Mike Pompeo visited last year for a very important report to them on how the Trump administration will work with the British to continue the special relationship. Even though that was not necessarily Donald Trump's policy, Pompeo insisted it was. Also working with the Henry Jackson Society is Sleazy Steve Bannon, who is a constant promoter of a narrative of the U.S. having to take on China. A second group is the Atlantic Council, and we've documented this in the past, but the Atlantic Council was very much at the center of anti-Trump operations during the Russiagate period. Now they're taking the lead in attacks on Russia and China. That's not to say they weren't doing that before, which is why they attacked Trump. But now there are at least two initiatives from the Atlantic Council. One is called the D10 Initiative, which is to use the upcoming G7 meeting in England to have Boris Johnson insist on adding India, Australia, and South Korea to form a D10, a Democratic 10, to do what? To confront, encircle, and contain China and Russia. That's what the D10 initiative is, and Johnson has the support, supposedly, of Joe Biden for this. The second initiative was a document called the Longer Telegram, which was a reference back to the 1946 Long Telegram of George Kennan, which laid the basis for the Cold War containment of the Soviet Union. The Longer Telegram not only insists that China is an aggressive power that we must confront, but lays out a strategy for targeting Xi Jinping. If you want to talk about interference in other nations' affairs, that's exactly what the Atlantic Council is calling for. Now, how do you fight this? Well, Lyndon LaRouche developed a counter strategy which fits in not merely with what President Trump was talking about of strategic cooperation with Russia and China, but with economic cooperation. The four-power agreement that the US, Russia, China, and India, as the four most powerful sovereign nations outside of the control of NATO and the City of London, could join together for an alliance for peaceful cooperation and economic development. This would not only militate against war, but would offer the opportunity for the U.S. and others to join with the Belt and Road Initiative and similar type projects, which LaRouche identified throughout his long career, for economic development in areas which otherwise are target areas for war and confrontation. Toward this end, President Putin called for a summit of the five powers of the UN Security Council. This did not take place, even though President Trump indicated a willingness for this. This was in January 2020. Helga Zepp-LaRouche had her own call for a Russia-China-US cooperative conference, a summit. This is still something which could take place and is essential. because we have to break out of the geopolitics of the British Empire. And we have to go with LaRouche's four-power agreement to do it, because these four powers alone possess the leverage and the economic weight and the military power to confront what is otherwise a runaway British Empire, pushing for a global bankers dictatorship called the Great Reset, and the deconstruction of the advanced sector economies through the Green New Deal. So either you stick with the empire and go back to the Middle Ages, provided you survive a war, or you move ahead with LaRouche's four-power agreement. We'll be talking about this increasingly over the weeks ahead, but it's time for the American people to grab onto a solution and not just react to the psychological warfare and operations being run by the British Empire. Thanks for joining me, and I'll be back with you again tomorrow.